A recording of this webinar will be available if you just enjoy my lovely voice so much that you need to watch it again, or if you want to share with other staff or colleagues that you think would be interested. Just shoot me an email. My contact information will be at the end of the webinar, and I will get that recording to you. Also, a follow-up and confirmation email will be sent probably tomorrow. I think it's sent one day after the webinar to confirm that you did attend, which should be all you need, most people, for training hours. But if for some reason you do need a certificate, again, you can just email me and I can get that to you. My name is Heather Herman. For those of you who don't know, I work with the Tennessee Coalition, and I have my lovely colleague Kelly Peters here to help answer questions. So if you do have any questions or concerns during the webinar, please just use your chat box and we will be able to answer those as we go along. And we'll have some time at the end of the webinar for questions as well. All right, I think that's everything. So we're going to go ahead and get started talking about primary prevention. Our goals today are to talk about the best practices in primary prevention, to explore prevention strategies, and understand ways to plan and implement your prevention efforts. I know from looking at the attendee list that there were a lot of colleges and universities registered for the training today, which I'm really excited about, and we're going to talk a lot about some really creative campaigns and how to implement campaigns on campus or in your communities. One thing that I always like to start off with when I'm talking about prevention is this quote. Both the CDC and the World Health Organization have called violence against women and rape an epidemic, a public health issue, and a human rights violation. And what this quote is has a twofold meaning for me. First of all, while response, appropriate and victim-centered and trauma-informed response to survivors is amazing and something that we advocate so hard for here at the Coalition, the problem is that no epidemic can ever be ended by only paying attention to treatment after the fact. So it's so incredibly important for us to pay attention to and enact prevention efforts in order to truly make a change in our society. And not only that, but no epidemic has ever been resolved by paying attention to the affected individual and not to the actual illness. And in this case, paying attention to victims or potential victims rather than factors that cause people to perpetrate violence. The CDC uses a four-step approach to address public health problems like sexual violence. This is their four-step approach to enacting prevention campaigns and prevention strategies. And the great thing about this is it's not just a theory. It's something that's been put into practice over and over. These are the same 4 steps that the CDC enacted in their smoking cessation campaigns, in drunk driving campaigns, in campaigns against driving without seatbelts. And we know through research that developing campaigns using these strategies to help shape our actions is incredibly effective to reducing the problem that we're targeting. Prevention is a systematic process. It's a holistic and encompassing process that has to take place at multiple levels of society in order to be truly effective. One thing that we talk about a lot in our field is the level of saturation within a community or within a society, and so having higher levels of saturation of prevention efforts within every level of society and community is incredibly important to reduce and prevent sexual violence. So when we talk about every level of society and we talk about a prevention framework, what we're really talking about is this socioeconomic model of prevention, which is visualized here. It starts at the core with individuals and goes out to relationship, community, and societal levels. Primary prevention is driven by promoting healthy environments and behaviors, by identifying root causes of behavior, and by changing society as a whole. And all of these levels have to be involved somehow in the change in order to make that change sustainable and lasting. Prevention on a social, societal level concerns changing laws and legislature, media advocacy efforts, social marketing campaigns to change broader mythology and broader stereotypes in society. The example I have here is Rhode Island's Lindsay Ann Burke Act, which requires that each school district develop a dating violence policy to address incidents of dating violence, that each school district provide training to administrators, teachers, nurses, mental health staff at all middle and high school levels, that each school district teach age-appropriate dating violence curriculum through health education classes every year from the beginning of middle school to the end of high school, and that they also enact dating violence awareness training for parents. So this is a hugely multifaceted law that's addressing training towards children, training towards faculty and teachers, training towards family members, that has changed a lot of typical and normal practices in society where you may get, one small section on health education and healthy relationships in middle school and then you never talk about it again. So what we're doing with laws like this is really increasing saturation and making sure that we're effectively reaching as many people as possible. This includes policies that address sexual and domestic violence. This includes protocols that are put in place to make sure that policies are followed and enacted, and any services and resources that are available at a broader societal level to aid in prevention efforts. Prevention on community level includes really changing social norms within that particular community. We know that every community is different, whether you're talking about a neighborhood or a city or a college campus or a work environment, however you define your particular community or set of communities. We know that the norms and the mythology and stereotypes involved in communities are all different. So when we're talking about prevention on a community level, we're talking about addressing these norms, promoting positive norms, and doing community organizing, which helps not only prevent violence but raise awareness of the problem. So we're talking about Walk a Mile in Her Shoes campaigns, white ribbon campaigns. We're talking about bystander intervention skills here. And just building capacity on a community level in order to sustain and get people involved in these prevention movements. Prevention on the individual level is talking about changing individual belief systems, changing individual attitudes, increasing knowledge of violence and why violence is perpetrated, reducing victim blaming, challenging rape myths, strengthening bystander intervention skills, and ultimately the goal for prevention on individual levels is altering individual behaviors. And that seems like a really daunting task, but when we're working on law change on a social level, when we're working on campaigns within the community, when we're working on getting more visibility and challenging myths and encouraging bystander intervention, then prevention and change on an individual level is kind of the next natural step there, and it kind of comes along with the campaigns in other levels of society. So really quickly, I want to talk about the difference between prevention and risk reduction. Risk reduction addresses the behavior of the potential victim. We've all seen different tools of risk reduction, and I think that so often it's confused with prevention efforts. We've heard tell women to walk in lighted areas, to look under and around your car. We've all seen advertisements for self-defense classes, and I'm not saying that there's anything particularly wrong with being careful and with things like self-defense classes, but making those things the center of any prevention or awareness efforts, making those things the only go-to information that we put out there for victims, for potential perpetrators, really is actually damaging in the long run. All of these things really reinforce the notion of personal responsibility, as in the responsibility of the victim, and help create a false sense of security. That if I don't go to that part of town, then I'm safe. If I don't go out late at night, if I don't drink so much, then I will be safe. Which increases isolation in people who have already been victims, because they're looking back on these messages we get in society about doing all of these things, checking off this list of risk reduction techniques. They're looking back on all the things they've heard and analyzing themselves and their own behavior, and that leads to a lot of self-blame. That leads to victims saying, you know, maybe if I hadn't gone to that bar, maybe I was flirting, or maybe it is my fault. So instead of enacting consequences for potential perpetrators, instead of putting expectations on people not to commit these crimes, it's instead putting expectations on victims to be perfect and protect themselves. And we all who work in this field know that no victim is perfect, and that the only thing that it takes to be a victim is being in the presence of a rapist, and that all of these risk reduction behaviors and techniques really just mask the true problem, which is people committing these crimes. So here's an example of a risk reduction campaign that's sort of disguised as prevention. It's from a police department in, I believe, Ontario, Canada. But you can see here how it puts the onus on a victim to protect themselves. Alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. How much have you taken already? And this really clouds the issue that alcohol is used to facilitate these crimes. Alcohol is used by perpetrators to facilitate crimes against women, against victims. So it's something that is very deliberate in action. And so having these kind of campaigns where you're putting an expectation on the victim or potential victim really takes the focus off of the perpetrators, who are the ones who are committing the crimes and who are the ones who are using alcohol in the first place very deliberately to commit them. This is another half of that same campaign. It's equally kind of victim blaming and placing that equal amount of shame and responsibility on victims for their own attacks, but my least favorite part is right here where it says rape stays with you for life, and that's talking to the victim. And it really makes me a little angry when I see campaigns like this that are sort of purporting to be prevention campaigns, and they're really focusing so much on blatantly blaming victims for not being somehow magically able to prevent their assaults. And I am also reminded of the Steubenville case where when it went to trial, a lot of what we heard from the media was about the perpetrators and those poor boys and how their lives were ruined, and how horrible for that girl to report something that happened to her. So I think that we see a lot of times these really victim-blaming campaigns that are disguised as prevention, and we have to be very critical of what we're putting out there. We're talking about risk reduction techniques here. Never leave your drink unattended. Limit your alcohol intake. Carry your keys. Always go with friends. Don't accept rides. Don't wear revealing clothing. Always carry a cell phone. And like I said, we know as adults who have worked in this field that none of these things can truly stop a rape from happening. We know that rapes happen, the majority of rapes happen in people's homes or in environments that they're familiar with. We know that the majority of rapes happen not by strangers, but by loved ones, friends, and acquaintances. We know that women of all ages, men of all ages are raped. We know that people who are wearing sweatpants and sweatshirts are raped just as much as people who are wearing miniskirts. So all of these things, while they seem like helpful or at the very least not blatantly harmful, really do feed into this victim-blaming language. When you see things like the risk reduction tip is always watch your drink, don't drink too much, be responsible, and then you hear people saying about victims that it was her fault she was so drunk. Why was she out so late? She flirted with him. She went home with them. She did. How all of these stem from those risk reduction ideas that we so often put out there. Here is an example of a really negative campaign, again, placing all of the responsibility of safety onto the victim. Don't leave yourself more vulnerable to rape. Drink simply and get home safely. So again, it's not addressing perpetrators or potential perpetrators. It's not addressing the factors that we know cause rape or contribute to rape, but it's addressing these really outdated ideas of what a victim or potential victim looks like. Don't be a victim. This kind of language is really common in risk reduction campaigns that are disguised as prevention. We will look later on at a campaign that deals really positively with the correlation between alcohol and sexual violence. But I know I've already said this once this morning, but it's really important to remember that alcohol facilitates rape in that perpetrators purposefully use alcohol to incapacitate their victims. So putting the onus on potential victims not to drink too much completely ignores the fact that perpetrators use alcohol deliberately. So traditional prevention approaches to violence against women have tried to teach individuals how to avoid and minimize danger, and that is what we're talking about when we say risk reduction techniques. And as such, they ignore substantial evidence that violence is learned, that in order to truly prevent violence, we need to make cultural change at every level of the socio-ecological model, that we need to focus on the actions of perpetrators and potential perpetrators, that we need to challenge cultural norms that allow violence to take place. And those are the truly effective methods of prevention, whereas victim blaming techniques have been shown over and over and over not only not to work, but to actually harm victims more than they're helping. This is a campaign from Not Ever in the UK, and it's a really amazing campaign that puts all of the onus not to rape on potential perpetrators. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek campaign, or at least this example is, but it really shows us what something can look like when we're turning around these risk reduction techniques, and instead of aiming them at victims, we're aiming them at potential perpetrators. Risk reduction and victim blaming makes it so much harder for victims and survivors to speak up about what they've experienced. The great thing about prevention is that it challenges victim blaming culture, it challenges rape culture, and not only does it help prevent violence from ever happening, it creates a culture of vocal support for victims, which allows more and more victims to come forward and get the help that they need and hold perpetrators responsible for their actions. Prevention addresses the behavior of the potential perpetrators as well as the social norms that condone violence and support violent behavior. This includes victim blaming culture, rape culture, sexist humor, rape jokes. I've heard recently, and I think it's an amazing quote to share with you guys, that the only person who truly thinks a rape joke is funny is a rapist, because when we talk about these victim blaming attitudes, when we make sexist jokes and jokes about rape and jokes about violence, we are enforcing the idea that violence is okay and that perpetrators' actions are okay. And so prevention challenges these root causes, these root societal norms that allow it to be okay to blame victims and joke about rape and violence. And some of those root causes that prevention, really successful prevention campaigns challenge are sexism, racism, heterosexism, or homophobia, and classism. In order to prevent violence against women and sexual violence in general, we have to really understand what our society and culture believe about the roles of women and men. And we have to understand the cultural and social norms that tell us how to act as women and men. Sexism, racism, heterosexism, they support and reinforce really rigid gender roles, and they lend themselves to a culture of silence and a culture of shame, because sex is a tool of violence. And in rape, when sex is a tool of violence, and we have these underlying root causes in society of sexism, that tells us that sex is shameful and men are superior, then it makes talking about rape a really shameful and difficult thing. These things also tell us that some victims are more or less worthy of belief, and that we can ignore violence against certain groups of people because they are less worthy of our attention or our care. And so the social norms we're campaigning against and we're challenging are based in cultural tradition. They are the attitudes, the values, the beliefs, the behavior shapers that sanction this rape culture and this violence in our media, in our language, in our advertisements. We are kind of bombarded by all of these kinds of negative cultural attitudes through the media, where we are objectifying women and glorifying violence. And generally the media does not show pictures of healthy environments and healthy behaviors, does not show examples of healthy communication and healthy relationships, because this volatile, unhealthy, argumentative relationship model seems more interesting. So the examples that we get in the media, in television shows and entertainment, are negative examples because it's seen as more salacious or drawing more viewers or more normal than healthy examples of consent. And the literal, sometimes, and figurative objectification of women in the media teaches that women are only something to look at, that no one is interested in their opinions, that they aren't there to be heard and respected. And it teaches us that women are literally objects, and we can treat objects as less than a person. And that leads to it being much easier for us to turn away from and ignore violence perpetrated toward women or toward other minorities, LGBT individuals, when they are seen as less than or treated as less than in society. And we see, like I said, a lot of examples of really negative relationships, really victim-blaming relationships and predatory interactions, predatory sexual interactions, predatory romantic interactions. And what I'm showing you right here, in case you are not familiar, this is still shots from a song, and transposed next to them are victims holding up quotes from their abusers. So it's really easy to find negative examples of relationships in society or predatory examples. It's kind of the norm. You have things like Twilight, and you have, romantic comedies where they hold up this sort of norm of lying to your partner or badgering or bullying your partner into going out with you, and that being the normal thing to do. So it's much easier to find those negative examples than positive examples. Even in advertising, this is hard to believe, but this is a real campaign. It really happened. It's not fake. Belvedere was forced to apologize. They were forced to make a good faith donation to RAINN. But what's really interesting to me is that the image in this advertisement was used completely out of context. It's a still clip taken from a comedy video. The video had nothing at all to do with rape or sexual violence, but taking this one particular still clip and juxtaposing it with the wording that they've used here obviously has those connotations. They were also forced to pay some reparations to the actors in the clip for using their images without consent. And this, again, is a real spread from a real magazine. I apologize for the sort of horrible nature of the images. There were much worse images from this particular campaign. But we see so much in the media. I think this is a really overt example, but we see how sexualized violence has become. And when violence is sexualized and when violence is seen as sexy, we know that sex sells. So invariably that means that violence also sells. And what really strikes me about these particular images, they're selling, by the way, men's clothing and or women's shoes. And so what really strikes me is kind of the casual use of violence to get people's attention, to sell something. And that is how deeply permeated in society this idea of violence as being normal and normalized is. And it also feeds into the idea that, men are socialized to be sexually aggressive to the point of almost predatory is kind of the norm, and we know very good and well that not all men, and in fact most men, do not commit sexual assault or domestic violence, but the men who do commit these horrible acts are being reinforced by the ideas in the media that hypermasculinity is the norm, and that men who don't follow this norm are also subjected to violence, often sexual violence. And men are sort of seen as, like I said, the ones who are supposed to be the aggressors in the relationship, and by simply not following that norm can be really endanger themselves of aggression. And again, these are all real advertisements, I promise you. They've all been featured in magazines actually within the past few years. And so when people dare to go outside of these boxes that society puts men and women in and refuse to act in these certain ways, then they risk isolation, they risk violence, they risk death. And we know that, and that's why prevention is so important, and that's why changing these cultural norms that reinforce violence are so critical. And so one of the really important things to talk about when we're talking about prevention is we need to be clear on what we're trying to change and what we're trying to combat, but we also need to be very clear on what we as a movement are promoting. And this shift from negative cultural norms, from inequality, from normalized violence into positive, respectful norms that encourage equality. I want to talk here briefly about risk and protective factors. This risk and factors are associated with greater likelihood of sexual violence perpetration. They're a combination of individual, relational, community, and society factors. Yes, we're talking about the socio-ecological model again, but it's very important. And they contribute to the risk of becoming a perpetrator of sexual violence. So understanding risk factors can really help identify opportunities for prevention. The CDC conducted a systematic review of risk and protective factors for sexual violence perpetration and identified a number of factors at the individual and relationship levels that have consistently over and over time been supported in research that shows that they do have some kind of correlation and impact on increased perpetration of violence. And some of the individual risk factors that they have identified are general acceptance and exposure to violence, coercive sexual fantasies, which we see over and over again in the media like Twilight, exposure to sexually explicit material, general hostility toward women, which was reinforced in the cultural and media objectification of women, adherence toward general traditional gender norms, and hypermasculinity, which we talked about, is also really highly reinforced in the media. Some relationship risk factors include association with other people and other peers who are also hypermasculine and sexually aggressive, lack of institutional support within their community, the general tolerance of sexual violence within their community, which we know is such a huge risk factor because of the way that we are socialized and because of the way that society reinforces these rigid gender roles and these victim-blaming attitudes. We know that in many communities there is sort of an implicit tolerance of this type of violence. And, you know, societal norms that support sexual violence and support traditional gender roles and male superiority and sexual entitlement are huge risk factors for perpetration. So that's the kind of things we're trying to target and change through our prevention campaigns. Protective factors, which may lessen the likelihood of sexual violence, perpetration by buffering against the risk, include emotional health and connectedness, empathy, concern, healthy active bystander training, healthy relationship education, and consent education. All of these things decrease risk of perpetration. And if you want to find out more about risk and protective factors or view the complete list, you can go to cdc.gov or simply Google CDC risk and protective factors, and it'll pop right up for you. So taking account the risk and protective factors around violence perpetration, when we look at prevention strategies, some of the really effective strategies that have been proven to actually work over time include empowering women and girls, media literacy and challenging those hypermasculine and objectifying things that we find in media and advertisement, rethinking those rigid gender norms, making sure to involve men and boys in our prevention efforts, because like I said, we know that the vast number of men in the world are nonviolent, and so they are amazing allies in this work. Bystander intervention techniques and training so that we can have more active bystanders, healthy relationship education, healthy sexuality and consent education, and making sure that we are engaging young people, because it's never too early to start crafting these healthy, respectful, and emotionally healthy youth. So here are some examples I wanted to share with you. We've had so many really great examples of empowering women and girls in advertising lately. This one is the Dove Unstoppable campaign. We have the Pantene Not Sorry campaign, which is addressing the sort of cultural norm where women have been socialized to apologize before they speak a lot of times, when they're asking for help or when they just feel like they're interrupting. And so this is kind of combating that norm. We have the CoverGirl Girls Can campaign, which is empowering women and girls and rethinking socialization that tells girls that they can't do certain things as women. We have the Verizon Inspire Her Minds campaign, which is a really amazing campaign to get girls and women more involved in STEM careers and education. That's science, technology, engineering, and math education. And really challenges the socialization that says that women should go into these more passive fields, more helping fields. We have the Always Like a Girl campaign, which you may have seen the commercial during the Super Bowl this year, which is really sort of trying to challenge the idea that girls are somehow lesser and this, throw like a girl, run like a girl is a bad thing in society. And then we have the amazing Nike Voices campaign, which is targeting young female athletes and really trying to empower young athletes to continue in their sports fields when athletics we know athletics among girls drops off dramatically in middle school and high school. This is the Girls Against Violence, Girls in Technology campaign, which is really amazing, which encourages women, again, in STEM careers and really encourages women of color and is a very inclusive campaign that's very vocal about healthy sexuality and healthy relationships against violence. This, really quickly, is a great example of not only empowering women and challenging gender roles and showing women as heroes, but really inclusive and representational campaigns and representational views in media and in entertainment of not only girls and women being powerful, but women and girls of color being powerful. Can you still see my screen?
I can, but you can see your cursor moving around.
This is the Our Strength is Not for Hurting campaign, which is an amazing example from Men Can Stop Rape of how to really involve men and boys in your prevention campaigns. And we know what one of the most powerful types of prevention campaigns, and something that's actually kind of a new idea and a new emerging discipline, is bystander intervention campaigns, which ask people to move from passive bystanders to active allies in fighting against sexual violence, bullying, hazing, homophobia, sexism. All of those root causes that we've talked about can really be addressed in bystander intervention campaigns. And it addresses the bystander effect, which we have a lot of research showing that the more people in a group who witness something happening, the less likely they are to intervene, because they always think that, well, someone else will say something, someone else will do something, but we know that that's not true because everyone in the group is thinking someone else will do it. So what bystander intervention is saying to people and training people and giving people the tools to do is stand up and intervene and say, if I don't intervene, then who will? The great thing about this campaign from Make Your Move Missoula is that it addresses individuals and communities to generate positive social norms change, so just change those, negative stereotypes into something positive. and it intervenes directly in attitudes and behaviors that promote and condone gender-based violence. So this is all about, healthy relationships and challenging norms, and including bystander intervention in that. And, the amazing thing about bystander intervention is that it works on every single level of the ecological model. We can do really huge, broad-reaching societal bystander campaigns like this particular Men Can Stop Rape campaign, which has been super widespread in the past year or so. And we can also do really personal, direct behavior change among individuals. This is an amazing example from the UK, again, that not only involves men, not only involves healthy sexuality and consent and communication, but is very inclusive, including the LGBT community, which we know deals with sexual violence on the same rates as the heterosexual community. And here is another example of a consent campaign involving alcohol that is actually targeting perpetrators and not the victim. And, we look at so many of these campaigns, we think they're so serious, but the truth is that prevention campaigns and consent campaigns in particular can be really fun and eye-catching and joyful and creative. And consent campaigns can really start conversations. And they don't have to just address consent to sex. They can address consent to touching and consent to talking and all these different levels of consent and levels of relationships. But the great thing, again, about prevention campaigns is that they can be light and they can be fun and they can be creative in ways that still allow individuals to really connect and start conversations. This is a great campaign from South Dakota State University, that's a consent campaign based on Dr. Seuss. There's, these great positive consent campaigns that no means no, but only yes means yes. This was actually in the USF Student Affairs in their book that they pass out to all incoming freshmen about affirmative consent. This is a great play on the Harry Potter series, but talking about consent. It's really creative and eye-catching. So you can do these creative things. You can also really get specific with consent campaigns. This particular campaign addressed Halloween on a college campus and the increased risk of, or increased reports of, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual violence during Halloween week. So they went and specifically addressed the problem on their campus, in their community, and targeted the very specific problem that was happening. We can target very specific communities when we're talking about sports communities, where we often have that really masculine culture, and we often have a lot of rape jokes and rape culture and hypermasculinity. So we can address sports culture and sports communities. We can address teens and young adults, high school and middle school, and kind of get down on their level. This campaign is the That's Not Cool campaign, and it really addresses digital harassment and abuse, which is really unique to certain age groups. You can also address military communities, and we know that sexual assault is such a huge concern within military communities, so having specific targeted campaigns there is really helpful. And so again, the amazing thing about prevention campaigns is they can be targeted toward your specific community and the problems within it. And campaigns are really effective when they remember that there are male victims and that they are incredibly diverse and inclusive of the diversity within your community, the diversity within relationships, and they are remembering that male voices are important and diverse voices are important within these campaigns. So we're back again to the CDC's 4-step approach, and we're going to talk really quickly about implementing campaigns. And the first thing that I would tell you to do is when you are thinking about or preparing to implement or design a prevention campaign for your community, whether it's a campus community, whether it's a city, whether it's a military base, it is a team effort, and you should include on that team voices of the audience that you're trying to target. If you're trying to target college students, then there should be college students on your prevention team. If you are trying to target members of the military, then there should be members of the military on your prevention team. If you are trying to target the LGBT community in your area, then there should be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender members on your prevention team. Prevention is only as effective as it is when it's truly targeting the audiences that you want. So the first step in the CDC's 4 steps is to define the problem. And the problem in this case is sexual violence within your community. So then you have to ask who is committing the violence, who is perpetrating the violence, and who is being victimized by the violence. You have to understand where the violence is occurring, and you have to understand when. Is it at a specific event? Is it during Halloween week? Is it during rush week? Is it at a specific time of year that it's happening more often? And when you get really specific in defining the problem, then you can get really specific and effective in targeting it. Identify your risk and protective factors. These protective factors and risk factors will be unique to your community. They could include sports culture, that culture of hypermasculinity. They could include bar culture and alcohol. They could include Greek life. You could be talking about a very specific event, again, like Halloween, but when you're identifying the risk and protective factors that you want to address within your campaigns, you're allowing yourself to be more effective. Develop and test your prevention strategies within your group. Make sure that everybody is resonating with them. Take them out into the broader community. You can have focus groups and talk to the people that you are trying to target and make sure that your campaign strategies are resonating with them. Your campaign should be culturally specific, like we talked about, whether your culture is team sports, Greek life, college campus, military, LGBT community, whether your culture is your specific city, whatever culture you're trying to address, it should be targeted to people within that specific community. It should be relevant to those people, and that's where making sure that you have them in your focus groups and on your boards is really important. And we should make sure that it is effective over time. And the only way for prevention efforts to be truly effective over time is to target those root causes that we talked about and to try to make a cultural change. And then we assure widespread adoption. And the best way to ensure that people adopt it is by using those risk and protective factors and making sure that it's relevant to the people you're targeting. The more relevant your campaign is, the more likely people are going to be to adopt it, and cast a wide net. If you're targeting sports teams, then your campaign could be in the stadium, in the locker room, at rallies and events for the team. Make sure that you're thinking outside the box when you're distributing your campaign materials. The more people see it, the more effective it's going to be. So I'm going to really quickly give you some examples. This is from UCLA's Alcohol is Not Consent campaign. It is a positive, the promised positive example of addressing alcohol as a correlation with sexual violence. Here they've defined the problem in their community as sexual assault in the presence of alcohol. They've identified that they want to change the blame it on the alcohol mentality, and they have formed a really amazing group, including students on campus, to develop this campaign. They are targeting the victim blaming mentality around alcohol use. They are changing rigid gender roles and challenging these ideas that rape is solidly a women's issue. They are making sure to look for change over time and targeting behaviors, including challenging people to be more effective bystanders, which makes campaigns really lasting and effective over time. And they are making sure that they're culturally specific and inclusive to not just one type of victim. So we are going to wrap up here because I don't want to leave you all beyond the hour that we had allotted. But if you have any questions, now is the time to put them in the chat box, or feel free to email me later on if you think of something and we can find a time to talk, or I will send you any resources that you may need. So any questions?
You received some from DeMarcus Jackson, but he had to leave to go teach, so I'm going to give you all that and you'll email him. But his questions were, are there any free online-based sexual violence prevention trainings that college students can access, that you know of any?
I don't. So the question was, are there any free online prevention-based trainings for college students? There are not that I know of in terms of online modules, but there are some free curriculums out there, and I can share those with you guys in a follow-up if you would like. Anything else? All right, well, like I said, here is my contact information. Feel free to email me with any concerns that you may have, any questions that you may have that you may think of later on. I can email you, like I said, the recording of this PowerPoint. I can also email you the PowerPoint directly so that you can have all of the resources that I included. And I'm here anytime that you need me to answer questions about getting a prevention plan in place and starting a prevention campaign. I know that it can be really daunting to start a campaign, but we at the Coalition, and me specifically, are always here if you need us. All right, thank you everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday.